Hello, I think that we are live. Thank you all so much for tuning into our stream. We are The Novel Neighbor. We are a local independent bookstore in Webster Groves, Missouri. We do so much more than books too. We are also a community meeting space and an art hub for collaborators in the St. Louis area. And tonight we are talking to two St. Louis natives, Rebecca Schwarzlose and Sahar Alam. Thank you both so much for joining us. Tonight we are discussing Brainscapes, which is Rebecca's brand new, incredibly, it's blowing my mind as I'm reading it, and I can't wait to hear tonight's discussion. The best description I can grab is from the inside cover. It's a path-breaking journey into the brain, showing how perception, thought, and action are products of maps etched into your gray matter, and how technology can use them to read your mind. So it's going to be a wonderful conversation. Before we get started, I'm going to give you a quick bio for Sahar and for Rebecca. Sahar Alam is the author of the novel The Groomed Who Have Been, which won the 2008 Janet Heidegger Kafka Prize and explores the sudden new pressures on the principal character's Indian Muslim identity in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. And she was a finalist for the 2018 Zank Fiction Prize for her manuscript, The Emrikiad. Am I saying that right, Sahar?
Mm-hmm. Enrique.
Perfect. Which tracks the process of becoming an American by exploring how immigrants and fiction writers share a compulsion to maintain imaginary worlds. Presently, she is at work at a historical farce that contains the interplay between nationalism and narrative control by circling the Indian mutiny of 1857 and featuring Charles Dickens as a central character. She has held fellowships from Emory University, the Howard Foundation at Brown University, and the Regional Arts Commission of St. Louis. She has over 12 years of experience teaching fiction writing, and in 2020, she received the Marian Horstman Online Teaching Innovation Grant. This summer, you can take an online writing workshop with her or other writers of other genres at WashU's Summer Writers Institute, which also offers writing-related programming that's free and open to the public, which is incredible. Thank you so much for Sahar for joining us tonight. Next, we have Rebecca Schwarzlose, who is a postdoctoral research scholar in the psychiatry department at WashU in St. Louis. She studied psychology and linguistics as an undergraduate at Northwestern and received her doctorate in neuroscience from MIT. She served for 3 years as the chief editor at Trends in Cognitive Sciences, a scholarly journal that covers topics in cognitive psychology and neuroscience. Rebecca carries out scientific research related to sensory perception, cognitive development, and psychiatric illness. Through her research, she helped discover and name a new brain area called the fusiform body area. She is the recipient of a grant from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation program in Public Understanding of Science and Tech, which supported her work on Brainscapes. The book has received several early accolades, including a starred review from Publishers Weekly, selection as a PW Book of the Week, and selection as a nominee for the Next Big Idea Club Summer 2021 season. Brainscapes is Rebecca's first book, and we are so excited that you're with us tonight to celebrate it. So thank you both.
Thank you so much, Cassie.
Awesome.
We're delighted to be here.
I'm going to pop off screen and let you two steer the show, and I will be watching along with everyone else. So excited. Have a good one.
Thank you. So first, I wanted to hop on just to say thank you to all of you for coming. Thank you to the Novel Neighbor for putting on this event, which we are really excited about and I really appreciate. And just to say thank you to the Novel Neighbor for being a pillar in the community, a wonderful institution for local books, a wonderful place to go and browse, or like me, have your kid's birthday party. And I'm grateful for what they have provided to our community, including they've brought children's authors to my daughter's school. So they're very remarkable in how they've reached out to the community and brought a lot of resources here. And I want to thank Sahar Alam for coming and speaking with me. Sahar is a dear friend of mine and also a brilliant novelist and a writing teacher. And I couldn't think of anybody else that I wanted to talk to about my book and about these ideas more than her. She is such a thoughtful person, and she has kind of engaged deeply with a lot of these topics from a very different perspective. So I was really excited to get to talk to her about these ideas today.
Well, thank you, Rebecca. It's my great privilege to talk to you. I mean, I feel like I have been talking to you actually for a long time. I drifted over into the connection between reading and neuroscience by accident many years ago. And, in 2012, and when I met you a few years ago, 5 years ago or so, and you started describing what you were writing about, I felt like I had a resource that I just couldn't believe I'd run into. So thank you so much. And thank you for including me in this conversation. And congratulations on your book. It's wonderful.
Thank you. So Sahara and I had decided I would start by doing a very brief little reading. I'm going to just read to you from the very beginning of the introduction. It's not my absolute most favorite section, but it's the best section to start with because it'll also help us explain some ideas that are going to come up in the course of this conversation. So I will just read a couple pages quickly, and then we can start the discussion in earnest. Let me be clear. This book is about real maps in your brain. I am not being metaphorical or using artistic license. There are actual maps in your brain, and not just one or two maps. Your brain is a teeming atlas of them. Before I explain what I mean by a brain map, here's what I don't mean. Scientists and science writers often describe neuroscience research as brain mapping in news articles, popular books, and lectures. By this, they mean the scientific effort to discover, for example, which chunks of the brain make you feel sleepy or help you select one dish from a crowded restaurant menu. This so-called brain mapping doesn't create a map so much as an inventory of known brain regions, a list that resembles a mechanic's list of automotive parts. Each part, from the crankshaft to the muffler, has a specific function and belongs in a specific place in the car. Likewise, this brain inventory lists brain chunks, their locations within the brain, and their suspected purpose. But once neuroscientists discover an area of the brain to add to the inventory, they inevitably zoom in and investigate it closely. When they do, they often find that this chunk of brain has its own internal organization, an astonishing layout that forms an actual map. Simply put, a map is a spatial representation of something else. When you think of maps, you probably think of geographic maps, which represent locations on the surface of the Earth. But you could just as well map locations on the surface of the moon, or the arrangements of stars in distant galaxies. In fact, maps are not limited to representing physical locations. The maps in your brain chart your body, senses, movements, and crucial sources of information in your world. To grasp the beauty of brain maps, you need only think of their coordinates. Geographic maps have spatial coordinates, or units of distance, such as kilometers or degrees of longitude and latitude. A point on a geographic map gives you a location on the surface of the Earth. But a point on a brain map may give you a flash, a flavor, a note, a twitch, or a tingle. Your brain maps of vision represent the droplets of light that strike the delicate sheet of cells at the back of your eyes. Your maps of hearing represent frequencies of sound impinging on the sensitive coils buried deep within your ears. Your touch maps have skin coordinates and represent each instance of pressure, warmth, and pain along the many planes and valleys of your skin. Your brain contains spatial maps, which help you interact with the world, and movement maps, which plan what you are about to do, the next blink, swallow, or step. Literally, these are maps of you, of your body from your eyeballs to the bottoms of your feet, and what you do, what you need, and how you interact with the spaces around you. Your brain is brimming with remarkable maps that represent these facets of your world and more. But brain maps aren't just remarkable, they are also important. They offer deep insights into us and why we remember, imagine, learn, and think the way we do. They allow us to peer into the minds of other people, even other creatures, and infer how their perceptions differ from our own. They expose how children learn from and adapt to their surroundings, sometimes with lifelong repercussions for health and well-being. And increasingly, physicians, scientists, and corporations are using brain maps to develop technologies that bridge the divide between computers and brains. In short, brain maps hold profound psychological, philosophical, societal, and technological importance. They are a key to understanding ourselves in the present and to deciding how brain technologies will shape our societies into the future.
Well, that may not be your favorite section of the book, but I think it captures one of the, or reflects one of the pleasures of reading this book, which is that the writing is so exact, vivid, and fresh. And your presence as a writer is something I can feel on every page. I wanted to talk a little bit about the writing process in a little bit, but first I was hoping to maybe get a concrete example of a brain map. One of the astonishing things that I found in your book was the visual map, V1, as you call it, as it is called, I think, and how it works in the brain. In the section that you read, you mentioned being able to peer into brains, how these brain maps enable that. And we can talk about that maybe in a bit, but just if you could talk a little bit more in concrete terms, like what a brain map is, and then we can talk about the implications.
Absolutely. So some of these ideas are familiar to people who have taken intro to psychology. There are certain maps they may have heard about in intro to psychology. And one of them, which we kind of use to dive into the idea of brain maps, is primary visual cortex, or V1, as you mentioned. And V1 is really a relatively large chunk of brain divided between your two hemispheres, and it's at the very back of your brain, as far as you can get from your eyeballs. And across the surfaces, it's actually spread out across the surfaces, is a representation of what you can see with your eyes. And this map is laid out relative to where you are pointing your eyes. So it represents what you are seeing, the light that's striking your eyes, all relative to where your gaze is directed. And this representation I talk about, it is instantiated by neurons, actual cells that make up that tissue, but they represent information by shooting off electric message, and how fast they do that contains information that actually represents the information that came in through our eyes. And so with modern technology, so this was initially discovered because people would have head wounds, and they would damage the back of their brain or have a bullet come through the back of this tissue, and it would actually pierce that map in a way where they would now have a region of blindness. And so even though their eyes were still intact, and in some cases they were really quite still functional, they now had lost a specific piece of their visual field. And so that was how scientists first began to put together that this map existed in the brain, and that there was a physical layout on the surface that corresponds to what you see. And now we can actually render these maps visible, including with functional MRI. So we can stick somebody in an MRI machine with different settings, and we can actually see how what we're showing them is reflected in the activity in this map.
So if I understand it correctly, and I'm not sure I do, but let's say I'm looking at this pencil. So what you're saying is that this pencil is reproduced in my brain, and by the neurons. They shape themselves, they form themselves into the shape of this pencil momentarily from brain tissue?
That's a great question. So what they actually do is, so the neurons are fixed. They're like the pulp in a piece of paper. They're not going anywhere. But each of them has this predisposition to representing something in particular, certain part of your visual field. Okay. And so what happens is when you look at something, you're placing the light information, the light bouncing off of that object, your fovea on a certain part of your retinas that corresponds to a certain part of your visual cortex, the part that gets the grandest state, the most ample representation. And so if you could so the neurons don't change shape and they don't change color, but they change their firing rates. And because of where they're located, if you can translate their firing rates into color, for example, or which you can do with animal research or with a brain scan, you can actually see what would look like a pen, if that's what you've been looking at. So it is creating activity, electrical signals, which are recapitulating that shape across the surface of your brain. But it takes some special trickery to be able to see it.
And just continuing on with the visual a little bit, you get into the concept of imagery and being able to see something, detect something without actually taking it in through your eyes. I don't know if we're jumping forward here too much, but I was curious about how the idea of imagery fits in with brain mapping and how the brain maps sort of play a role in creating that imagery in our brain when the stimulus is not actually outside of our brain.
So that's a wonderful question. And imagery is different for different people. And that's one of the things that I talk about in the book, first of all, is that there are a good chunk of the population, when they imagine something, they don't see it in their mind's eye. And so for those individuals, they may not be using their brain maps, but to create their experience of that mental image, because they're not experiencing the mental image, right? But for those of us who do actually create, to some large or small degree, a sensory, a kind of a experience in our mind, and a mental image that is more or less like seeing something. For us, that is happening by engaging the areas of the brain that also process the sensory stimuli. So if you look in a map, in the visual V1 map, the visual map, and if I were to see a picture, there would be a certain pattern of activity in my brain map that would reflect the picture. But if I were to close my eyes and I were to imagine the same picture, that would create a pattern of activity in that brain map that is very similar to what I would be generating if I were looking. It's like a weaker version of what would be happening in my V1 cortex if I were looking. So it's kind of amazing, like this brain, all the rest of the brain that is, forever in the dark, can generate this, a very similar pattern of activity, which in turn generates a very similar pattern of experience for us when we create a mental image as when we see something. And this is true for other senses as well. It's true with touch. If you imagine touch on your skin on a certain part of your body, this can actually be detected if you're scanning somebody and you have them imagine being touched on their arm, and you look in the part of their map that represents their arm, you can even detect that they are imagining being touched at that moment. And it's very similar to what would happen if they were actually touched.
So I think I told you this, we talked about this once before, but in the early weeks of fiction writing courses, we talk about details and the value to a writer of concrete details. So details that engage a reader's senses. So for example, a velvet voice somehow engages the reader more than the phrase "a pleasing voice." So a descriptive adjective versus a judgment adjective. And it seems as though, and this is the connection that I was making when I first met you and learned about your work, that brain is so embodied. It is part of a body. We think of the brain and the mind as being sort of separate and existing separate from our senses somehow. But in fact, one of the takeaways for me from your book was that it's not only not separate, it is so much shaped and shaping our sensory experience, shaped by them and constantly magnifying certain experiences in order to make sense of them. So could you talk a little bit about the interaction of the brain and the senses more broadly, either across senses, or how they come together to make, our experience of the world? I mean, one of the things that came to mind as I read your book was, well, if we're all taking in the world in ways that are shaped by our brain maps, how much are we taking in the world?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So that is absolutely true. So I talk about this in the book that actually there's a period of kind of tremendous plasticity when a baby is first born and begins to experience sensory inputs outside of the womb, and there seems to be this incredible amount of learning. So even though our genes have carried out as the brain is developing in utero, have carried out this kind of extraordinary choreography of kind of structural creation to make this brain that is already very complex when a baby is born, in that it has all the connections that are ready to make these maps. And it's actually it's been kind of already training these maps. So your eyeballs make waves that start training your visual maps, even though you can't see because you're in utero, and your ear, actually your cochlea has developed these little structures that make waves that start to train up your sound frequency maps. So this is already happening, but when you come out and you experience the world, there is an amazing amount of plasticity so that if a child experiences like a stroke, or perhaps a child is born blind and therefore is not receiving any visual input because of something that's happened in their eyes, the brain is able to reorganize how it uses different areas that would otherwise kind of go unused. And so I think it's kind of remarkable that a child is being trained by the sensory stimuli in their environment and whatever's coming in. And that is really kind of further crafting and specializing and shaping their specific brain. And then, what's kind of remarkable about brain maps is then they tend to crystallize. So even though we continue to be able to change our brain maps, and there are other parts of our brains that function not as maps, but via what are called distributed population codes that are much more flexible and able to change and learn throughout life. But these maps, to some degree, they kind of, once they're set, it's harder to dramatically change them. And so that does sort of give us this kind of neural scaffolding that has been trained by our environment and that is very much steeped in our sensory inputs, our physical body, and our experience interacting with the space around us. Mm-hmm. And so all of that naturally creates a brain that is very tied up with the body, so that those things the two can't be extricated from one another.
Yeah. And in your book, which features so many beautiful and illuminating hand-drawn or computer-produced, but seeming hand-drawn illustrations, you have lots of other creatures, so non-human creatures, and you discuss how they too have brain maps and how their brain maps are overlap with ours, but then there are these amazing differences and the implications of those differences. Could you talk a little bit about just the design of the book? How is it that you, first of all, got interested in brain maps, but then how is it that you decided, was it through the study of other species or through humans? And how did you bring all these examples together?
I'd love to answer that. So I became interested originally in brain maps because of work that I was doing in my graduate studies, which was, I was studying areas of the brain, which I talk about in one of the chapters, that become specialized for helping you recognize very key sorts of objects and people and stuff in your environment. And if these regions get damaged, you can be unable to recognize your own children, or be able to identify what common objects are based on sight. So these areas are kind of remarkable in and of themselves. And I was studying a very well-known area that processes faces, specifically very helpful fusiform face area. And then right next to it, there was this body selectivity. And so there was kind of hints that there was something like maybe this area is also responding to helping you recognize the body. And so we helped to, my advisor, Nancy Kenwisher, and we worked on kind of looking closer at these areas and showed that they dissociated, so that you had these two areas next to each other. And even though there's a lot of variability from one brain to another and exactly how these are and how big they are and how they're shaped, they were always just like smack next to each other, just like a head is next to a body. And so that got me to think a lot and sort of shaped the dissertation, which had to do with like, what are the organizing principles of these object selective areas? And I started to draw on a wider literature that reflect from other sorts of brain maps that neuroscientists have studied, and just got very excited and sort of obsessed with the idea of maps, some of which have been known for since the 1800s, and some of which are just being uncovered as we speak. So it's kind of like it's the new story that's also old but keeps being new. And so trying to figure out how to kind of describe that and explain that idea, and then further to kind of push forward and say, what is this? How is this further helping us understand ourselves, how our minds work, kind of the limitations that it places on what we can think about and imagine and remember, and how things feel to us, how we behave, in many ways can be shaped by the idiosyncrasies of our brain maps. So exploring that, talking about that, and then realizing the kind of incredible technological significance of brain maps, I wanted to also be able to lay that out as well, because that is becoming very much an increasingly important topic for us as a society to kind of start thinking about seriously.
Yeah. And maybe we could talk a little bit about that, as you do in the second half of your book. What are some of the ways in which our ability to detect and use the information that we get from brain maps, how is it kind of moving forward, and what are people imagining that they're going to be able to do with it?
Yes. So we are, and I realized part of what your prior question related to was tying in kind of all these different species and everything that I didn't get to that, but I can get to it here, which is that so my training at when I was a graduate student was very much at the intersection of cognitive science with humans, and then also electrophysiology in animals. So work where people, you put an electrode into the brain and you record signals from the brain. And so that literature, I was familiar with that literature, and it speaks so well and kind of collides so well with the human work and kind of supplements it. Mm-hmm. So I had trained, in my training, I had been exposed to that literature, and I think it's incredibly powerful for helping us understand these brain maps and how they work. So bringing those details in felt like second nature. But trying to imagine being other animals, or like what sensation is like for them, that was new. That was a lot of fun.
Well, can I just add that one of the one of the observations I had when I was reading your book is that the two words that come up so often are beautiful and imagine, where you direct the reader to imagine. You are constantly sort of saying, imagine this is happening. Imagine that this is like this. So you're using analogies, similes, metaphors, but you're also guiding, giving us information to be able to imagine something that seems so alien to our experience. So and part of what I found, both alien, but then through the clarity of your writing and the way you've laid out these concepts, I felt like I could hold on to it. Was just the I guess you talk about it as magnification, and how certain, and I apologize for abusing these terms, but how certain species have certain kinds of maps, and therefore they magnify certain senses in certain ways. We humans have a set of those magnifications or warpings that we do, but say a rat has a very different set of warpings or magnifications. So there was some it seemed like as though you were giving us a sort of language through which we could understand the way we take in the world, versus it's not as though we were in the thoughts of the rat or anything like that, but we could imagine how the world appeared to the rat. And I guess this we can talk a little bit about that, but also I wanted to connect to your title, which is Brainscapes, and how Brainscapes relates to brain maps. So one of the most compelling analogies that I found in your book was the one that you have about the subway map in Boston, and how you use that analogy to describe what a brainscape is. And then perhaps we could sort of talk about how brainscapes connect across species, or wherever you want to go with it.
Sounds great. Yeah. So as you mentioned, as the subtitle mentions, these maps that are in our brain are not veridically representing what's happening in the world around us. They are warped, and they are warped in such a way that they devote more space, which means more processing power, which means more ability to, better ability to detect, and more ability to represent little detail. And they're warped in such a way that reflects kind of our own bodies and how we use them. So we have obviously we have touch receptors that are like in the skin, and they're not equally distributed across the skin, and they actually are receiving like if you have pressure, you are impinging on them in such a way that they are picking up that something is touching you, and then they translate that into an electrical signal that then travels to the brain. And then in these brain maps, that's where that touch, which even though it happened here, it's got to be represented here in order for you to craft the sensation of feeling it, that awareness that you have felt it, right? But we have more touch receptors in certain parts of our bodies than others. But our brain maps by far further, like disproportionately represent some areas than others. And some of, from Psych 101 may have seen the kind of homunculus with the big hands and the big lips and face. And that's supposed to reflect the idea that we do have kind of such a disproportionate amount of capacity to feel with these particular sweet spots, which arise first from our body, but even more so by the ways that our brain is warped. Mm-hmm. And actually, to return to something that was in one of your questions previously that I didn't get to touch on, I would say you kind of said, well, what does that say about what we're not feeling? Mm-hmm. So that these are the limitations of our senses and what our sensory maps represent is kind of filtering what we experience. And so it does mean, and we have to do this because, we're trying to represent a whole world / universe in something that can fit inside a hat. And we can only do that if we discard a lot of irrelevant stuff, or basically anything that's not probably vital to us. And so there are many mechanisms by which our bodies and our brains are do that and make that possible for us, so that we can make the most of this, what is actually a rather modest chunk of tissue that has to do all that we ask it to do.
Yeah. And you talk about this in several chapters of the book, but just how it seems like the brain, there are limited resources, and so there seems to be an interest in optimizing them. And you, I think, use the word in sort of a ruthless impulse to discard things that are not, as you say, vital to us at a particular moment or within a longer period of time. I had a question about how, this was sort of a final question, but I feel like it's a good time to ask it. But just with your understanding of the brain, knowing what you know now about it, how does that shape how you maybe go about your life or go about parenting? I found myself thinking so much about my 5-month-old niece as I read about how that infant brain is so plastic and it's such an important time in which those brain maps are taking a shape that they then hold on to for a long, long time. So I was just curious about how either the experience of writing the book or getting into this research has shaped how you go about things that you did before, or new things that you do now, parenting and how it might shape your future research too.
Well, so I think one thing it has done is sort of instilled in me sort of a reminder of how remarkable the developing brain is, how incredible it is that it is just sucking up so much information, and in a way that allows it to represent the world it's been exposed to maximum effect, for decades later. And so that's it. We kind of see newborn babies and they're like a lump and they look very they're not that interesting. They're very cute. But it's kind of fascinating to think that their brains are capable of this kind of incredible plasticity that ours no longer are. And in fact, one of the things that I like to kind of turn on its head a little bit in the final chapter is to say, we, in society, but also kind of in science, we tend to talk about the developing brain as sort of like a means to an end. Like the brain is, you want to just get it to where it's an adult brain, and that is the goal, and everything is about how much it can get there. And so, I think actually there's a lot of reason to think about it as like, that very early time of experience is creating this and kind of solidifying, crystallizing this structure, which has been certainly set up through genetic, genes and evolution that have sculpted this basic structure of the brain. And then with early experience, you kind of fine tune these maps. And then, then we sort of, and then things sort of get static. And then we have to still learn how to tie our shoes and balance budgets and, all these other things, right? Which we managed to do thanks to the power of analogy and thanks to the distributed codes that we use to sort of kind of flexibly learn new things and harness different brain maps and different actions in a flexible manner. But what really we should be doing is thinking about how what we're doing is we're walking around with what is more or less, a baby brain, that we should thank our baby self for giving us this brain. And then what we do is we find these kind of amazing ways to wring so much more out of it as we grow, as we learn how to read and we learn how to speak, and we learn how to think about abstract ideas and represent time and distance and all the other complicated things we do. And I even talk about how, and you can actually see how we harness these very embodied spatial maps to do such things. They are helping us in supporting that. And so in that way, our kind of complex ways that we think, even when we talk about, when we as scientists think about a concept, we need to put it in a graph and look at it spatially, because we have trouble comprehending it unless it is in a spatial form that we can then use our kind of spatial resources and maps to process and understand.
And is what about the order in which you wrote the book? So the you move in a particular order in terms of the senses, and as you move forward, you describe senses, I think, that have more unknowns about them, right? And I'll let you talk about that order and maybe what went into the design of the book, but and also the discussion. So I was just curious about that. And also, you use a lot of analogies, and as I said, your writing is so fresh and vivid and imagistic. And so, okay, so the first question was about order, but the second question is, in terms of the structuring the book, did you work from the analogies outward? Did the analogies sort of come to you, or did you, you're working through a chapter and you land on a connection and you search for an analogy? I mean, this is, of course, going to be different for different chapters, but I was just curious about how you put together the book.
So the analogies came as I was writing the book, but when I outlined the book and really was trying to structure it, I was thinking very deeply about, I didn't want anyone to get to a chapter and not have the knowledge they needed to be able to fully understand that chapter. And so I had to kind of start with the basics of, what are these maps? How do they work? What are they made of? And then we could talk about how does imagery work in these maps? What is the role of these maps for imagery and remembering the experience of memory? And I hope by the end, when we get to near the end, when we get to brain-computer interfaces and these ways in which these maps serve as portals for technology, I hope that by walking through those different kind of ways in that sort of order of increasing complexity, we get to a point where it makes perfect sense, because we know that these maps do X, and we know that when you imagine, then it's like similar to seeing or feeling. So by the time we get to how somebody would trigger a BCI to move a robotic arm with their motor map, you say, yeah, sure, of course.
Yeah. Well, I had that very experience. I on page 58, I got to the sentence, just as V1 magnification affects visual spatial acuity, S1 magnification affects tactile spatial acuity. And my first thought after reading the sentence was, well, of course it does. Because I feel like you just sort of prepared me to understand this complex sentence and all the concepts within it so well, through the use of, it's not as though there isn't technical language in here as evidenced by that sentence. It's just that there's a great deal of freshness to the writing and to the use of writing techniques. That you sort of attend to so much of what I need as a reader to follow along. I particularly loved the characterizations that you associate with certain aspects of seeing, the fovea and the periphery, right? It just sort of helps me understand and imagine these concepts. I get there much more quickly than I think I would have.
Thank you.
Hello, how are we doing?
Good.
I could listen to you both talk about this forever. You have I really can tell that both of you have taught before, because I'm just learning so much and taking this so well, and I'm sure that everybody watching has as well. We do have a few quick questions. And I think that some of them could go to both of you. Some of them are more towards Rebecca. The first one, which I thought was very interesting, was it was about grief and how or if brain mapping impacts or influences the response to losing someone.
That is a really interesting question. So I think grief. I mean, I think that emotion and grief and sort of attachment, those are things that I don't tend to associate with a brain map in particular. Mm-hmm. Brain maps provide that embodied, so that, for example, when you love somebody and you come into physical contact with them, you know their smell, you have a baby and you put the baby to your lips and you feel mm-hmm. them with your lips. There are all these ways in which we are using our senses to engage and develop attachment. And so I think that is part of being and maintaining attachment. And then, losing that can be, so in that respect, losing the person, you can mourn the things that you've lost in the sensory inputs. But I do think that's kind of like a higher level thing. So, when you get to like the really complicated things that we do, that we experience, and I talk about this with the communication and meaning, that there are ways in which we are having these codes, these areas that operate by codes that are flexibly kind of pulling brain maps in and helping represent these ideas. And so there may be ways in which, like, grief could be, there are ways that we may feel grief in our body that may be part of how we represent what grief is. Mm-hmm. But translating kind of grief directly as it is such a complex idea to a brain area would be very difficult.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting.
That is
okay. So next, it was about your publishing process, how that was different from an academic paper. And Sahar, I think especially for you, having published fiction, I think that's an interesting conversation as well. So the differences between nonfiction and fiction, and also from more of an academic source.
Yeah. Maybe I'll start with academic versus
perfect,
and then we'll go to fiction versus nonfiction. This process is very different than publishing an academic paper, where you work with your collaborators, you write up a draft, you write the whole paper, you send it to a journal, and you wait for it to be peer reviewed, and then hopefully they like it and want to accept it. Often they don't, and then you start over. You resubmit. So in this case, it's a lot more. In some ways, it's a lot more like fiction writing, in that you ideally you want to find a literary agent, somebody who can represent you and help you find publishers who would be interested in your work. And so on the one hand, you have to be able to kind of present yourself to the agent and to the publisher, explain why you are knowledgeable in this area. And you also have to give them a sample. So you put together a proposal in the case of nonfiction, transitioning to nonfiction, you put together a proposal, which is like a table of contents and what you want to, what you want to get across in your book. And then you give them like a chapter or two of the book that, of the manuscript that you'd write. And so you want to show them that this is going to be a great book. I can write a great book. The rest of it's going to be great. And then, hopefully you can get an agent interested who can then get a publisher, or hopefully multiple publishers interested. So you actually don't have to, and you tend to not want to write the whole thing before you go through the process of finding an agent and then a publisher, because you may get very helpful feedback along the way about framing, etc. So it's best to start with a small amount, and then you can work with your editor. My editor, Alexander Littlefield at HMH, was fantastic and just wonderful, and had this developmental aspect of giving me feedback as I went along. So that process is different than, I will send it over to Sahar, who will tell you about fiction.
Yeah, so there is a overlap with the second process that you described. But with fiction, at least in my limited experience, the book has to be written before you approach an agent. And so you're approaching the agent with a cover letter and a description of the book and perhaps a sample chapter, or asking if the agent would like to take a look at a sample chapter. And then you, and obviously you approach many agents. And if you get lucky, one will be interested. And then you work with an agent to perhaps revise and prepare the book. And then the agent takes it out to an editor, to many editors, hopefully at publishing houses. So the one big difference is from these two data points is that with fiction, the book is already written. It's not that it's in its final or even close to final draft, but agents are looking for books that are they have compelling material. You're showing them that you're able to write, and that you're able to revise. They're probably looking for that too. Yeah. I hope that was answering the question.
No, it absolutely was. I think that was great. Rebecca, what drew you to the neuroscience field originally?
Well, I think a couple things. One is I sort of was an introspective kid, and I would more sit on the sidelines and watch other people and think, why are we doing that and why are they doing that, than being in the action, playing with the other kids. So I think some of that was honestly just, sitting on the sidelines, being a little awkward and thinking about why things are the way they are and why we do those things.
Neuroscientist or writer, either neuroscientist or writer gets you there.
So I think that's part of it. And yeah, I think that a lot of the things that drew me to neuroscience, what is this world about, and why do we do the things we do? Those are a lot of the same questions that probably do draw fiction writers to the act of fiction. And we're kind of exploring the human experience from different perspectives. Did you want to say something, Sahar?
I have a weird confession to make, which is that which I've hardly shared with anyone, but now I'll share with the entire world. So I have a great deal of undue pride in my ability to recognize faces. And my husband and I have been trying to figure out how to monetize this for years, but we haven't found any way. But when I read your book and read about how a child's brain is being shaped by experiences, and the fact that there are limited resources available, and I connected maybe my ability to recognize people with the fact that we moved around a lot as a child, which I always thought was part of why I became a writer. I was constantly sort of seeing new people, seeing new faces. There's always change in my life, but there was an interesting sort of connection up all the way through, which I thought that was the source of some of why I write. But also there's this neuroscientific connection in the sense that I wondered if my brain, because it needed to deal with a lot of new people, just started to focus on faces.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even just, if you're in a situation where that context, it's so important to have that information. You've moved to a new place and you need to remember who these people are, that you meet people. You could be, could get some adrenaline. It can actually change sort of your reaction in certain situations and what you're attending to in a way that is kind of highlighting and further training your brain on the information that to you was most important and adaptive as a child. That's very interesting and entirely could be. We don't have, unfortunately, good studies of these because we can't experimentally manipulate where young people live and what they care about. But it is fascinating to think about and wonder, and certainly each child's lived experience and what matters to them, can be very influential in what they notice later and potentially also in how their brains process information.
Okay, last question before we wrap up. And it's for both of you. What are you working on next? Are you working on another book? What can you tell us for what's down the pipeline?
I want Sahar to go first.
I'm working on a novel. I've been working on it for many years. And the novel is about, I wanted to write about the Indian Mutiny of 1857, which is one of the events, one of the first sort of global challenges to British colonialism. But as I was writing it, I discovered that Charles Dickens had, because he lived in that time, very strong opinions about what was happening in India. And I found that I was able to access that moment through him, rather than traveling all the way to India. So I ended up writing about, it was a moment of, great nationalism being stirred up in Britain. And I was interested in the connection between nationalism and narrative control, which is, of course, something that he exhibits to a dazzling degree in book after book. So right now I'm working on it's kind of a historical farce where some letters of Dickens have been found in Cleveland, and so we go back and forth between two time periods, the 1850s and Cleveland in 2015, when there's a rising nationalism in our country.
So. That sounds incredible, and I can't wait to have you back and we can hold that one in our hands as well. That sounds incredible.
Thanks.
So my answer is less exciting, which is why I wanted Sarah to go first. I am not planning to write another book right now. It took me far too long to write this one, and I absolutely adored writing it, but I am sorely behind in publishing research papers and need to be focused on that. But I have taken with me from the experience of writing the book, I feel like that has shaped how I move forward with my research. So I about a year ago, I joined I've moved from the psychology department to the psychiatry department, and I've been really thinking about psychiatry and development, and trying to really think about how these brain maps and how very early sensory experiences might be related to psychiatric illness. So I'm starting to research sensory sensitivity, the way in which children and some adults are, really big reactions, very distressed by certain sensory inputs that other people just don't even notice or care about. And kind of what is it that they're experiencing, what's causing that in their brains, and how that might, because that often can go kind of be correlated with mental illness, certain mental illnesses or certain kind of different states. What is happening there, and how might those be related? So I am trying to think about psychiatric illness through this lens that has been shaped by my experience thinking about brain maps.
That sounds fascinating.
And I also hope that there's another book sometime into the future.
Thank you. I don't think my family does.
How long did it take you to write?
I first had the idea 10 years ago, but there were long stretches where I didn't, I thought about it. I always thought about it. I was collecting in my brain ideas and notes and questions. But for most of that time, I wasn't actively working on it. So it really, when I got the book deal and was able to really devote myself, it was just so exciting. And it's been really gratifying to see it come together.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both so much for being here. We'll check back in 2032. Don't worry. It's been a really, really wonderful event. I've learned so much. I'm sure all of our viewers have as well. I wanted to say thank you on behalf of the Novel Neighbor team, and we will see you both soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Bye.